Hi, everyone. Welcome to interCHANGE. I'm Dan Jones. Thank you so very much for joining us. Of course, we'll spend most of the show talking about the recall election, why Scott Walker won big, and what happens next. And we're also going to talk about the never-ending cost increases for the University of Wisconsin colleges. Is it still a deal, or is it becoming out of reach for all but a chosen few? All right, let me introduce everybody. We have longtime newspaper columnist Joel McNally, Kevin Fischer, former broadcast journalist, political analyst, and oftentimes a fill-in host over on WISN Talk Radio. Denise Callaway, community affairs and public relations professional. And Gerard Randall, education consultant and local job creation expert. Rick Horowitz is going to be along with commentary at the end of the show. All right, the first thing we're going to talk about is the election. The turnout is huge. Walker wins big by 7 percentage points. And it's a quick win, called before 9 o'clock at night, even though many people thought this was going to be a razor-thin margin. It was going to be an all-nighter. We'd be up until midnight. So the question is, Kevin, does this make it crystal clear once and for all that the majority of people in the state clearly like what Scott Walker is doing?
Not only one time, but twice. Stephen Hayes of the Weekly Standard is very familiar with Wisconsin politics, has been writing a lot about this election. And he said, and I think he's right, that you can't overcomplicate this, that Scott Walker won simply because he promised that he was going to do something, and then he went out and did it. He ran on broad themes of fiscal responsibility and balancing the budget, did erase a huge budget deficit without raising taxes. In fact, property taxes were lowered. We now have a budget surplus, and he saved taxpayers $1 billion. He convinced a majority of Wisconsin voters that public sector union employees needed to throw in more towards their lavish pensions and salaries and benefits that the people who were paying for were not recipients of. He also was unflappable as a candidate. Despite the death threats, the intimidation, he stayed on course, he stayed on message, he was calm, and he was ever forward thinking. You also had a tremendous Republican ground game that resulted in massive turnout. Conservatives, Republicans were energized. And I think, too, there was a fair amount of people that said, we may not agree with the governor, but we don't like this concept of a recall. He was elected to serve a 4-year term. Let him serve it out, and then let's see what happens.
Denise,
and finally, a liberal writer in Madison, I think, summed it up best. Matthew Rothschild in the Isthmus this week said, "Spare me the spin. This was a whooping."
Denise, could the Tom Barrett campaign have done anything differently? Did they do anything wrong?
Well, I don't know that they did anything wrong. I think one of the problems that we had is that, perhaps we saw, this is perhaps the best example that we've seen since Citizens United about how money can spin and change an election. When you are outspent 8-1, it's very difficult to get your message across. So I think that Tom Barrett had a good message. The problem was he didn't have the money to really get out the information that he had about what he wanted to do, and to be able to raise very valid questions about whether or not Act 10 has been successful, the damage that it has done in terms of cuts to public schools and to municipalities, and also the ongoing questions about the John Doe investigation, some of which came up even in the last week before the election. So I think that was the real issue. I think this may be a case here where we've seen what happens when you have the best election that perhaps money can buy. The one thing that I will say certainly that the Republicans did better than the Democrats, and I don't think Republicans are going to make the same mistake again, is the fact that Republicans had a better ground game. They did a better job of getting out and mobilizing the vote. But again, a lot of that also comes down to money, because you don't make the phone calls, you don't have the buses and the vans and the other options that you have to get people out to vote if you don't have the money to get that done. So to me, money was the unseen party that was wrapped around this entire election. $125 million.
If Tom Barrett had the same amount of money that Scott Walker had, would he have won this campaign?
Well, I think it would have been fairer. I was impressed with the Republican ground game, but unlike Denise, I honestly can say, because I was pretty close to some of it, I thought the Democratic ground game was magnificent. When you saw in the inner city of Milwaukee, black voters lined up like it was a presidential election. Sometimes the lines for the new voters registering were longer than the lines for voters. I was so impressed with that. It was like when Republicans try to prevent people from voting, they're more determined than ever to fight for their rights. And I really think what happened in Milwaukee is going to really resound in November. That was the brightest thing I could take out of it, because rather than being crushed by this attempt to take their vote away, the black community in Milwaukee fought for their right to vote. I got to say, and I from the start I said, I really do think that most of the Republicans I've known all my life are not going to be very enthusiastic about Scott Walker because of the corruption, because of the dishonesty, because so much of the stuff was, Scott Walker, and everyone on this panel knows him pretty well and has spent a lot of time with him. He is the most pleasant personality, and he uses that pleasant personality and those big puppy dog eyes to use words that don't mean anything. And then the actions, when you see them, are simply ugly. We're talking about taking vote away. We're talking about, not just, getting the unions to pay more for their pensions, but crushing the unions, trying to destroy the unions, trying to eliminate unions. And we saw him, speaking in private, with one of his billionaire donors about divide and conquer. And when you have, as close as this state is, and I was amazed that the outcome this time was almost what it was the first time. I really thought there were going to be a lot more people turned off by the Republican tactics, by the Republican dishonesty, and apparently not. Apparently, if you can run on a no tax increase message without talking about what that means gutting education, that from kindergarten on up through the college. We're going to talk about college, what's happening to the colleges later. You're talking about, teachers that are totally demoralized all over this state, that they simply do not, they've been demonized, they see what they're doing having no value. I mean, that is a long-term loser for the state. And job numbers, the argument during the election was, are we the worst job creators in the state, or just one of the worst? And by using sort of fuzzy numbers that he made up at the last minute, he tried, the governor tried to confuse that issue.
The Obama administration confirmed the governor's numbers.
It still means that this is one of the worst job creators in the country, because it's based on a philosophy of taking money away from people so they have no money to spend, they have no jobs, and they have no money to get the economy moving again.
But not only did the Republicans, were they enthralled with Scott Walker, but if you believe the exit polling, a heck of a lot of union members voted for him as well.
Like 30 to 40%.
28% was
I think one of the
28%.
The things, and it's already been mentioned, the number of black voters who turned out, I don't think it was because of an affinity for Tom Barrett. I think it's because many of them are overrepresented in public sector unions, and they felt the impact closer to home with some of the policy changes. And that drove turnout, but it certainly wasn't enough given the length of time that the Republicans had to develop a ground game, the length of time between the last election and this re-election effort for the governor was pretty condensed. He was able to put the same team together and pretty much appeal to the same group of people who have voted for him the first time, those union folk that Joel had thought would turn and vote not for Walker but for Barrett. Evidently, a lot of them decided that they would hang with Walker for this time, again, for a variety of reasons. So the union support for him didn't turn away in the numbers that many had predicted would turn away from him on. And the black voter turnout was a lot stronger than even I had thought, because my view was with this same level of voter turnout in the African American community, that would be enough to put Barrett over the top. And the only good thing that may come out of that is that we have an election in November, and they can build upon that enthusiasm to vote, to stay engaged when the president is
Yeah,
up
I hope
for
the results
re-election.
of this doesn't crush that enthusiasm, and I don't think it will. I think, but I have to say too, and I said it last week, with this result, nothing has changed in this state. Nothing changes. You still have half the state who is extremely angry. You have a governor that they don't trust, and truthfully, the losing side in this case, I haven't talked to anybody on that side that expects Scott Walker to complete his term. They, in fact, expect him to be indicted, to be charged with crimes. And I still don't know why that was not an effective issue in the campaign, because it sure should have been.
Because he hadn't been charged with anything.
He has not been charged. He has not been indicted. And it's so much rhetoric and wishful thinking from the left.
And the FBI, when the FBI and the district attorney's office is on your case,
For 2 years and ongoing.
They're not going to quit. And you guys can see how close this is to him. Some of his longest, aides and the people closest to him, the very closest people have all been charged, and that's going to leave us with a lieutenant governor that I think the state has even less faith in. That she knows.
Well, now she too was reelected. She was reelected
Yes, she
on
was.
almost the same numbers, and
Palin of Wisconsin.
but there was an opportunity
I'm
if
glad to
people
see that
thought
Joel
that
is
she
such a
was
gracious
incompetent.
loser.
Yeah, well,
then there was an alternative that could have been elected
that I'm happy about.
instead of her, because they weren't running on a ticket this time. I don't know. I
don't play
think
what
that
if. What if he's going to be indicted? What if he's going to be charged? What if he has to
no,
step
I don't see an indictment coming.
I don't either. I don't see that. And the campaign's over, but yet we're still talking about this.
Okay,
And the reason
are
we're
the
still
two sides
talking-
going to get along any better 1 week from now, after a cookout, 1 month
I
from
don't
now?
think Rod and Beer are going to smooth over
No.
the philosophical differences that exist between this governor and state Democrats. That's not going to happen.
But if the Democrats don't get along with the other side, are they going to get anything done at
Well, the
all?
question I would ask is the flip side of that, which is if the Republicans don't do anything, are they going to be able to get anything done? Both sides, the worst thing that's happened about this, all of this, is how polarized people are and how absolutely rigid both sides have become in terms of being unwilling to move. One side because it believes it has a mandate, and the other side that says, last time we looked, this was a two-party country, at least a two-party country. So it is this inflexibility that I think has caused so much difficulty. I don't think that anybody would anticipate that, given everything that happened at the beginning of this year in Madison between Republicans and Democrats, and I think of the last-minute maneuver that was made to push Act 10 through the Senate, you're not going to find that, a couple of hot dogs, brats, and even a lot of beer is going to make a difference in bringing folks together. What Joel said is right about how divided we are. While the governor did have
state's always been
1.3,
divided.
but never,
Long before Scott Walker. It's always been a 50-50 state.
Never
Certainly in the last-
misdivided. Never misdivided, and never to this level of acrimony that exists between
There's no
both sides.
acrimony on the right.
Oh, of course there is.
We're not
Of
banging
course
drums
there
and
is.
tearing apart the
Kevin,
Capitol and blowing
Kevin, that is
Venezuelas.
not- that's not the
There's no
definition of
acrimony on the right.
That is not.
We're
the
not out of
definition
control. We're not
acrimony.
crapping on
You're
police
not-
cars.
That is not the definition of acrimony. It is not the definition of acrimony. And let me say, we still have 1.1 million people in this state who did not vote for Scott Walker. 1.1 million. That's more than the number of people who signed the recall. I think what Governor Walker is very smart about doing is saying is that this is a time for bipartisanship. The question and the issue that will come up, and Tom Barrett talked about this repeatedly, is whether or not state Democrats feel that they can trust Scott Walker, because it's, what's the saying? Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me.
I can
That's
Mind
gonna
who's
be
in
the
power.
question.
I can tell you
Keep
with
in mind that
We
it's
can
fine.
hardly
It's fine.
forget.
I commend the governor for extending the olive branch. Very smart, wise, prudent political thing to do, and it needs to be done. But in the end, After November, Republicans are going to control the state Senate, the state assembly, and the governor's mansion. And it's fine to reach out, but in the end,
great maps you all read.
Republicans have the power because the majority of the electorate wants that kind of
The
policy.
Republicans are going to have the power in the assembly and the legislature because of the way you all redrew the maps. That's how you're going to have the power.
It is true that there have been strong groups on both sides in this state forever. But it's this governor that repealed 50 years of laws that Republicans and Democrats had agreed upon. It is this governor who, despite what he says, with those, boilerplate statements about can we all get along, when he's speaking to a billionaire supporter of his, he will talk about conquering the half of the state that he has defeated.
And that talking point during the campaign did not work.
And when we're not going to be conquered, the people who didn't support Scott Walker are not going to be conquered. We believe in education. We believe in health care for poor people.
Governor.
We believe in voting rights in this state. We believe in all kinds of things that we're still going to be fighting for. And no, this isn't going to end, and it won't end until someone really brings us together.
Until Democrats are
until they win.
Someone really brings us together.
All right, next topic. For the 6th year in a row, the University of Wisconsin Board of Regents has raised UW system tuition, and again, it was by the maximum allowed 5.5%. They also raised fees, room and board, the list goes on. So tuition and fees at UW will now be more than $10,000 a year, with an estimated total cost of attendance of $24,000 a year. Is this outrageously expensive, or is it still a tremendous deal for a 4-year education at a respected state university system? Now, you were on the Board of Regents, so you voted for increases, and so you put up with this in the past in your life. Is there a stock answer that, it's still a deal, it's still a deal, it's still a deal?
Comparatively speaking, when you look at public universities around the country, if you look at our flagship university at Madison, that's a deal. Because of the quality of the university, the opportunities that people who receive degrees have once they graduate from there, and the cost of attending Madison versus attending some of the other Big Ten universities, or the cost of attending a private university of similar caliber in terms of quality. But what's happening for the average family is an increasing cost that they have not planned for. It's very difficult in this economy to save for college, and so many kids who do attend college are coming in with expected debt burdens that they just can't handle once they graduate. If you want to become a school teacher, the cost of the debt burden is overwhelming, and so you choose other professions. That leaves us with people who are entering into the profession, at the very least, are saddled with a lot of debt. When this 5.5%, which is the cap, was first instituted 6 years ago, it was with a wink and a nod. If we
wasn't this time too?
It was this time too.
There was no public hearing. There was no. It just kind of came out of the blue.
It was, if you allow us to manage the cut. And of course, the university system and corrections were the two big targets. And they said that if you allow us to manage the cuts and to generate the revenue that will offset some of the cut, then we can pass that on in the form of tuition increases. And there were a variety of little gimmicks that they used in order to make this happen. Well, that may have worked for 1 year, 2 years, maybe even 3. Now we're looking at year number 6, and people are fed up with it, because that's not the best way to manage a system.
The rationale is little consolation to mom and dad who are trying to send their kids to UW. From an economic perspective, I think this is absolutely outrageous.
It is.
This is far beyond the rate of inflation. And I don't know of many UW parents that got or are going to get a 5.5% salary increase this year. We've talked on this show, all of us to a certain degree, that we need to make the UW system more accessible to more kids. This only raises the bar that much higher and puts more kids out of reach to go to UW.
Is it the state's responsibility to keep a college education affordable?
It is the state's responsibility, I think, to do that. But beyond that, it's in the state's economic interest. We lag behind all of our neighboring states. in terms of the percentage of kids who, percentage of people who have a college degree. We're at the bottom when we take a look at what's happening in those states that are closest to us. That is not good for economic growth. You can't run and build up that economic engine if you don't have the fuel to power it. And the fuel is person power and folks having the opportunity to earn a quality education. Perhaps the UW can say, well, this is still a bargain compared to the rest of the schools in the Big Ten. However, we have the lowest percent of financial aid that we provide per student that any of the other schools do in the Big Ten.
Now, you talk to any lawmaker, and they'll say, okay, but there's only so much money to go around. Do we give it to UW? Do we give it to the technical colleges? Do we give it to K through 12?
We give it to all of those. Good God, education is the most important thing we can do for the children and the adults in this state. And I'm astounded sitting here listening to the two Republicans on the other side
Doesn't it just warm the cockles of your heart?
condemn this without even mentioning Scott Walker cutting hundreds of millions of dollars
Because he didn't start with him.
So did Governor
Without
Doyle.
even mentioning the Republican legislators
It didn't start with them.
not increasing. They could certainly have increased scholarships for needy students. You don't have to take all this out on the neediest children in this state. You don't have.
It's not just the neediest, it's all students.
It absolutely is, and I suppose you're upset about it's the better off students who aren't getting help. But let me tell you who gets hurt the worst. And
You're having a bad week, Joel. It's pretty apparent.
Well, boy, how can you guys sit here and criticize UW?
I'm criticizing the region.
Gerard used to criticize Jim Doyle for what he didn't put into education.
Did it a lot.
But he has not said a word about these enormous cuts in education under Scott Walker.
They're wrong. They're wrong. They're wrong. Does
keep
that
saying that then, and keep fighting.
Because that's what I believe, and that's what I fight for.
The operating budget is actually bigger at UW.
Here's what it looks like though for parents.
Don't.
The bottom line is you can talk about the operating budget, but most people who are sitting there with kids who are getting ready to go to college really don't care whether or not the operating budget
Isn't that what I said?
They care about what it looks like
This
for
is
their
the
kids.
next major civil rights issue in this country, and every level of government. Everybody has to get involved in it. We can't have kids graduating with hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt that they're never going to
Here's what this looks like in a real family's household in their budget. 2007, my son was a freshman at UW. We were looking at just under $19,000 for cost for him. 2 years from now, when his sister looks at the UW, it's going to be about $27,000, $28,000. That's a real family, real life difference. Where do families begin to make up that kind of difference?
Especially when incomes in Wisconsin are far below the national level and can't keep up with these kind of increases.
It is a huge problem. At the end of the day, this will not save the UW system. What it will do is hurt the long-term economic growth of this state because kids will not be able to afford to go to college.
And it's also atrocious that the UW Regents wouldn't even give serious consideration to even lowering that increase to like 4.5%, 4%. They threw that out the door.
All right. Back to the recall for just a minute now. How impressive was Scott Walker's victory? It was so impressive that even writing and editing consultant Rick Horowitz was impressed. No, really, he was impressed by this result and by two decisions that helped make it happen. Rick.
Well, that was certainly a short night, wasn't it? Props to Scott Walker, who delivered an old-fashioned beatdown to Tom Barrett, to the Democrats, to the unions. The man did what he had to do. There's a lesson there. It may not be a particularly comforting lesson for some of us, but it's a lesson. Now, you can argue that the result was a foregone conclusion, or you can argue that Walker really was vulnerable, and if he'd run a less skillful campaign, he might have gone down. The way I see it, Walker had two potential weak spots, and he was able to totally neutralize both of them. One, of course, was the John Doe criminal investigation. He undercut that one by pouncing on those stories about misreported, undercounted crime statistics in Milwaukee on Barrett's watch. You want to talk scandal? You want to talk shady doings in high places? There's one on each side. So, hey, they cancel each other out. John Doe is off the table. The second vulnerable spot, the bigger one, really, was this. State job losses worst in U.S. If anything was going to take Scott Walker down, it was his jobs numbers. So what did he do? He found a different set of jobs numbers, positive job numbers. Not big positive, but positive. It didn't matter that they were unofficial numbers, that they weren't due to be released for weeks yet until after the recall, or that they used a totally different measuring stick from what anybody had been using. Walker got hold of those numbers and he jumped on them. He took some of those millions he'd raised, another loophole, but legal, and he bought ads with them. You want to talk employment? You want to talk job creation? There's a set of numbers on each side, so hey, they cancel each other out. Jobs are off the table too. Now, some of us, the finicky ones, the ones who always dot our I's and cross our T's, we'd have said to ourselves, we can't do that. That's not really fair. We'll just have to muddle through with the numbers that are already out there. That's not how Scott Walker thinks. What matters most to Scott Walker isn't that it's a fair fight. What matters most is that he wins the fight. He carried 60 counties. He won by 170,000 votes. Like I said, he does what he has to do.
Well, thanks, Rick, and thank you so very much for watching. Enjoy the rest of what looks to be a beautiful weekend.